Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 7th of October and we will begin with the Yanchur River line, really deep Russian advances, storming several towns concurrently. We'll also look at Pokrovsk, where the Russians are making inroads in some of the southeastern high-rises. We'll zoom in on the Dobropillya bulge. There are a couple of changes of note. We'll look at Kostyantynivka, some of the pockets finally beginning to close over there. Moreover, Kupyansk, there is a major change to the gray zone over there, so I want to give that section of the front line a lot of sort of discussion today in the video. And of course, we'll finish off with Sumy, because for a change, for the first time in a while, we've actually seen the Russians advance over there. So let's zoom in on the Yanchur River line. As we do so, please like, share, subscribe, anything to boost us in the algorithm. What you guys can see over here as I work from the south moving upwards is that the Russian forces have been able to take over most of Malynivka. There was a hotbed of Ukrainian resistance, largely from the 79th Battalion of the 102nd Ivano-Frankivsk Territorial Defense Brigade, and they held out these small Ukrainian squads in the northwestern corner of the village, and also in some of the agricultural lands nearby. You could see them over here. And now, for the most part, they've been taken over by the Russians. You could see how the polygon showing Russian gains over here consists of 1.64 square kilometers of territory, and westwards it's an advance amounting to, let's see, about 1.8 kilometers. The Russians are about 3.2 kilometers away from the next village over here, that being Zeleny High. And there are many Zeleny Highs in this region, so don't get confused. This is the one directly to the east of Hulyaipole. Let's turn on the fortification map so you get an idea of Ukraine's defensive depth around here. So Zeleny High, Vysoke, and Vesele, they're not necessarily the most well defended, even when it comes to their southern approaches. There weren't direct trenches built near the line of contact over here. It was just sort of circumvented because the entire goal was to protect the perimeter of Hulyaipole, not necessarily the buffer zone to the east of it. And that means there will actually be opportunities to take over these villages, even if there are some crude defenses, some primitive ones that were built but never really completed. So there is actually a possibility of pushing over here to the east, although it is still pretty far away from Hulyaipole's outer defenses. It's still about 10 kilometers away. And we have seen no indication of the Russians even trying to pursue an attack south of Hulyaipole, given the fact that the defensive density over here is so high. Not even just considering the fact that we have these trench and anti-tank ditch maps shown in yellow and light blue. There are also dugouts in each individual dugout over here, or in each individual tree line, meaning that it's a hassle and sometimes does include a lot of combing operations that lead to casualties that just clear out plots of field, individual plots of land. And that's why it is so difficult to assault Hulyaipole head on, and it's why the Russians are now focusing on circumventing it entirely from the northeast. And we're going to look at that movement as the video goes on. You can see how a lot of these excess pockets or Ukrainian holdouts to the east of the Yanchur River, you can see that the river is marked over here. Those are now closing. The excess Ukrainian positions are simply untenable. There are only a few of them left, and the Russians are finally beginning to consolidate control over their main vectors of attack, and the Ukrainians lack the depth to continue holding on to the rest of the river valley, including in populated areas, meaning that the entirety of this network of Ukrainian villages that are all connected by paved roads will be under at least Russian threat, but they're also going to fall into Russian hands in quick succession given the current rates of advances. You can see over here 14.2 square kilometers of territory captured only within the past 72 hours. And this largely consists of open fields, but some of them also do have tree lines. And within those tree lines, as we reiterated, there are dugouts. So those are all cleared out, and the Ukrainians were squeezed out for the most part. It's not like there was, tree line to tree line fighting in these areas over the past couple of days. It's more so the fact that the Russians were advancing along a concentrated line. Over here, you have the road, and through that road, they were able to reach Poltavka and then expand westwards from there. And this led to a cutting off of Ukrainian forces. Maybe not immediately, but there was a potential for that cutting off, and it was no longer tenable for the Ukrainians. Perhaps only a couple dozen of them were still holding out over here. And so they had no choice but to withdraw westwards and try to at least hold out on the western edge of the river. But now we're seeing the first steps by the Russians to cross over because, again, the river itself is not a major obstacle. It's more so the fact there is a dividing line between two sections of, I suppose, a populated area. because you have the larger, more built-up portion of Poltavka to the west, and the Russians took over the rural, smaller section to the east, meaning that even though it's smaller, they at least now have this actual base, operating base, that they can use to cross over the river, and they can house forces over there in the basements. So they've been able to really improve their logistics situation. Because just imagine having to coordinate everything through Olivska, which is such a small village. So a company-sized force can't really use it as a lodging station, but now they have the eastern part of Poltavka to use as the anchor for further expansion. And disregarding Olivska, then you look at the other nearby villages over here. They're all small, and they're also relatively disconnected from the Yanchur river line, meaning they're like 9 kilometers away. Levadne, Stepove, Vishneve, not the best outlets for deeper attacks. And that's why this river line in general, including the eastern portion, but now let's say the Russians take it all over, it's going to be very important because it's going to shift all of the logistical and organizational nexus from the Mokriali river line, which is over here to the east, spanning from Komar all the way to an area like Oruzhenie, like Starmlinivka. All of those rear posts, whether they be like distribution centers or forward batteries for artillery or mortars, anything like that, eventually that will all be moved to the Yanchur river line within the context of advancing westwards into Zaporozhye, of course. There are other fronts that will still require the proximity that is afforded by having forces or distribution nodes in Velika Novosilka. But everything related to advancing into Zaporozhye will be moved over here once the buffer to the west of the Yanchur river line is, positively large enough. So let's just zoom in over here and remain focused on the extent of the advance. This advance through the open fields amounts to about 4.3 kilometers westwards, and it means that the noose is tightening on Poltavka, very close to actually crossing over. Houses have already been taken over on the eastern side, and also to the north, we have this advance by the Russians amounting to 7.3 square kilometers, and in terms of the advance westwards, it's about 4.1 kilometers. So again, pretty significant. And this means that most of Okhotnishi has been taken over by the Russian side. It's a very small hamlet, a couple of houses, and for the most part, they've been seized. What hasn't been seized is in a gray zone, and that's going to give the Russians an opportunity to cross over, seize control over some of the trenches that are defending the paved road running along the Yanchur river line, but also give them the necessary northern flank to exert pressure on Poltavka from another direction, in addition to the fact that from the south there's pressure, from the east there's pressure, there can also now be an outlet from the north. And so Poltavka, it is a relatively large settlement in relation to some of the other ones over here, but regardless, it is simply isolated. It's getting enveloped, and there are no signs of reprieve. You don't really see any sort of outlets or any sort of lifeline for them. Novouspenivska is 6.6 kilometers away, and it has its own difficulties, being a village meant to act as like the first absorption mechanism after crossing over the first line of defense in Zaporozhye. Looking at areas further north, the Russians have taken over the entirety of Novovasilivske. I'll turn off the fortifications now because it's cluttering the map, but you can see that they've been able to take over nearly 4 square kilometers within this particular endeavor, and the Russians pushed over here about 2.8 kilometers westwards. And as a result, Novovasilivske has fully been taken over. You can see that it is a relatively small village, admittedly, but it's over here, just one road, and all the houses within it have fallen into Russian hands. This is due to the efforts of the 394th Motor Rifle Regiment. That unit over here, I'm clicking on them. They have been very active in recent weeks, pushing westwards along Novoivanivka and along sort of the road network connected to it. And now they've been able to take over the first village that is to the east of the river, and they're continuing to expand now with the intention of taking over Novomykolaievka. That's their immediate goal right now. And we know this because they've already started to fight for the eastern parts of the village. Novomykolaievka also has an eastern branch that is located to the north of the Yanchur River, as you can see over here. And part of it has already fallen into Russian hands. We have a video here. I'll click on it so you guys can see. This is from the Unmanned Systems Battalion of the 110th Mechanized Brigade. They conducted FPV strikes onto Russian soldiers as they were getting close to the Yanchur River. The Ukrainians have mustered up some reinforcements over here, but not enough, in my opinion. They've mustered up 2 battalions of the 154th Mechanized Brigade. You have the 423rd Unmanned Systems Scythian Griffins Battalion. You have the 110th Mechanized Brigade, at least one of their battalions operating around here. You have the 3rd Mechanized Battalion of the Separate Presidential Brigade and its Nova Drone Company and Bulava drone units, so they're active around here. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the Yanchur River line. There are other reinforcements that were moved northwards to areas near Veliki Komikhalivka. But those were usually, and we'll get to it, but they're usually just forces that are an extension of a grouping that's located near Havrylivka or Ivanivka. So it's not really what I'd call a redeployment. It's just sort of moving them southwards by about 15 kilometers. It's still generally, give or take, the same sector. It's not a radical shift. It's just along the same general plane, there's been a change in priorities, and so it's being redirected elsewhere. But you guys can see over here the direction in which this is all going. The entire river line is buckling on the eastern end, and there's going to be no depth on the western end because you look at it, Uspenivka, being the largest village within Zaporozhia's portion of the river line, is only about 1.5 kilometers deep. And even though there are a couple of roads over there and a couple of houses with basements, it's not going to be that hard for the Russians to cross over a narrow river valley and then set foot and get a foothold. And at that point, it's difficult to expel them, and they only continue metastasizing from there. And once they get like sort of one village on the other side of the river, they'll be able to use one road network, and we can see it over here, to reach all the other ones. And so the dominoes are already sort of cast in stone, and this means that going forward, there's going to be a lot of emphasis on what can be done to the west of Uspenivka, the sort of open fields that can be exploited over here. Because I sense, and even when you turn on the fortifications map, I sense there is a gap over here that can be exploited to circumvent a lot of the defenses that were built to absorb attacks on Zaporozhia and just arrive at Hulyaipole from the north. Its northern flank is not necessarily the most well defended. You know, there are some trenches, especially along the northeastern flank, but certainly not a sufficient amount, especially when you compare it to the southern and eastern flanks. And the outlets, or the sort of the key to unlocking that northern flank, would be to take over this section of the Ukraine's territory along the Yanchur River line. And that's why I believe now there is this significant Russian push and investment in trying to take it over. You could see that, in addition, they were able to capture, the Russians, 2.11 square kilometers to the southeast of Novorohirivka. Novorohirivka is now contested, and the Russians are closing in on its eastern flank, and the western portion is still contested, but it is a bit isolated from the nearby Ukrainian villages because they are under assault right now. You know, case in point, Uspenivka. You don't really have any other villages nearby that can act as a sort of support system. Moving onwards, though, there is an interesting report from Deep State. They've claimed that for the past 2 days, the Russians have sent in assault groupings to storm Oleksivka. Oleksivka being a village that is relatively disconnected from the previous line of contact that we were aware of. It's about 5 kilometers to the west of the furthest Russian point when you're looking at it from a sort of horizontal plane. From a vertical plane, it's about, let's see, about 3.5 kilometers, but still it is a significant advance if it turns out to be confirmed. Deep State did publish images of Russian forces in Oleksivka, and they claimed they were located in the southeastern tip and that 3 Russian soldiers were killed yesterday. And so the implication would be that there's already a paved route the Russians have been able to exploit, and it's running along a power line, and they're using that to actually storm the village. They have not been able to fully take it over yet, that much is clear, but I'm already sounding the alarm bells because there is a possibility that this actually further develops and that there actually does turn out to be concrete advances in this area. And such an advance, the Deep State's claiming that it came from the eastern direction, while DivGen, their map, indicates that there was an advance along this paved road over here, pushing northwards. In either case, all of the excess fields, including the tree lines within them, they're all going to be cut off as a result, and the natural conclusion would either be encirclement of the few Ukrainians still resisting or just a withdrawal, and that would also mean that, you know, a pretty large surface area of territory would be taken over by Russia, something like 13 square kilometers. Oleksivka is an important village because it would act as a further anchor, sort of joining in with the capture of Rbove right now Verbov is contested. The 110th has a battalion over here that's operating, trying to block any deeper advances. And that's completely reasonable because so far the Russians have been able to advance along a very narrow corridor from Mykolaiivka all the way to Verbove without much resistance. Now on the ground, they're being countered for the first time over here, and that's led to a stabilization. But as the Russians begin to accumulate forces once again, and now they're trying out something new by attacking Oleksivka, that arrangement can change, and there could be, a splintering of forces to deal with different vectors, and then that's when the Russians can take advantage of the opportunity and penetrate where the Ukrainians are most weak. And so there still is this lingering fear that the expansiveness and the lack of static fortifications, and in some cases the lack of manpower and drone crews, can still provide the necessary sort of groundwork for a Russian assault that can arrive even deeper, right? Like Novoalexandriivka at high, and then the worst case scenario would be Vydradny, because that's the connection between Zaporozhye and Pokrovsk, which is a major city north of the Vavcha River. And so that would be a sort of long-term Russian objective. But I think in the immediate term, as I've been saying for a while now, it has much more to do with Hulyaipole and the Yanchur River line, because of the corridor afforded between these two major trench networks. In any case, though, the Ukrainians have found that they have the most success with their counterattacks in areas that are very close to the Vavcha River, which makes sense because those are the areas where the Ukrainians have the largest deployment of forces. Mykolaiivka has a large Ukrainian garrison that can have that pool can be pulled out of. You have forces that can then be redirected nearby to conduct counterattacks. And the Russians have not been focusing much on this region due to the natural barriers, including the forests and the river. And as a result, there's been several windows of opportunity for the Ukrainians to take back territory. And that would include the 141st Mechanized Brigade. They used Alexanderhrad as an operating base and moved southwards and took over much of Sichnevet, perhaps even the entirety of it. And this was done in conjunction with attacks by the 31st Mechanized Brigade that we'll get to. But in Sichnevet, 2 Russian soldiers were taken POW by the brigade, and this was on October 7th. They also raised their flags, Ukrainian flags, in the western part of Sichnevet. So we know for sure that there is an assault, and this agreement now between some depictions of the situation is that some claim that it's coming from a very narrow corridor that's sandwiched in between Khoroshi and Novoselivka, and then from there the Ukrainians arrive at Sichnevet, whereas others are claiming that it's directly south from Alexanderhrad, and then from there approaching Sichnevet, which I think that appears to be the most reasonable outcome in my sort of estimation, because the Ukrainians would be far more prone to getting cut off and isolated, and then we'd see proof of such destruction if they were to try to advance through open fields sandwiched in between 2 Russian-controlled villages. It seems more logical that they would use their forward bases near the river and near Alexanderhrad as the launch pad for an attack on Sichnevet. And besides, the 141st Mechanized Brigade is known for being the unit that is involved in defending Alexanderhrad. So they are, closeness and proximity to Sichnevet from there. In any case, in Novoselivka, I am expanding the gray zone because there is a video here from October 4th of a soldier from the 3rd Assault Battalion of the 225th Assault Regiment killing 2 Russian soldiers in a house using a rocket-launched grenade to fire outside towards those 2 soldiers. And that was geolocated to an area in southern Novoselivka, indicating that there is currently close quarters combat going on in the village. And so for the most part, I think it's a gray zone. The 31st Brigade is trying to clear it out in its entirety, and the goal would then be to sort of clear out anything to the east of Sosnivka, including Khoroshi and Voronezh. That would be the sort of larger Ukrainian objective in order to fully relieve pressure off of Veliki Komykhalivka. But for a couple of weeks now, this has not been the direction where Russian momentum has largely been focused on. And I think the Ukrainians, at this point in time, once they sort of alleviate the immediate pressure off of the city of Veliki Komykhalivka, they would be really in a position where they have to try to address all the other leakages that are currently going on and are currently presenting far worse and more structural, fundamental issues that can change the intricacies of the front line. But let's look at Zeleny High. I'm going to go through this very quickly because, we devoted a large chunk of the video to the Yanchur River. West of Zeleny High, 0.6 square kilometers worth of territory captured. A video was released by the Black Sea Lions group of the 37th Marine Brigade of FPV strikes onto agricultural lands, and this was on October 7th, indicating in advance, if we measure it, of about 700 meters westwards. So again, continued Russian pushes through agricultural areas and tree lines, any other position south of the Vavcha River with the intention of closing in on Andrivka Klavtsova and more generally anything that's on the Russian end of the Vavcha River. Some Russian sources claim that there has been a pretty significant Russian push through the floodplains to the south of the river to approach Ivanivka, but so far the degree to which this has occurred is not really something that comports with what we've seen in geolocations, and so I'm waiting for further corroboration. In Pokrovsk, some Russian sources claim that everything to the south of the T0404 highway, or 406 highway, has been taken over by Russia. Again, something that certainly could occur given the fact that there's been, Ukrainians have largely ignored the western flank of Pokrovsk. It's an area that's more open, and recently the Russians have pursued assaults on the Durniak microdistrict to the west of most of Pokrovsk, but we need a more concrete piece of evidence than just Russian reports on this that we've been reading, and that goes hand in hand with the reporting about the Russians taking over most of the microdistricts in southeastern Pokrovsk, including Zelenivka, Lazorny, Sonyashny, Pivdeny, Shakhtarsky, etc. For now, I've changed the map to indicate that the Lazorny microdistrict is a gray zone because it's undisputed by now that there are Russian DRGs and even regular forces that are seeping into these apartment buildings and trying to now undermine the Ukrainian defenses in Shakhtarsky itself, which for now still remains largely under Ukrainian control. But that situation can change, and the route through which is being changed is from the Lazorny district, which is the one over here that I'm zooming in on, that you see is marked as a gray zone on the map. But besides that, for the most part, the map does remain the same. You can see that there's a video here from the 68th Jaeger Brigade of an FPV strike on, it's called Chunichny, that's the name of the village, so I'll add the U. But that gives us a pretty good indicator that not only are the Russians still in Novoukrayinka, but they've actually expanded by another 50 hectares and taken over a nearby hamlet. And so this route along the rail line can actually be pursued to arrive at the southeastern dachas of Pokrovsk and at Novopavlivka. So those are all options right now as a result. Around Myrnrad, I'm also aware of the reports from Divgen that the entire pocket to the east of Kozatsky and Promin has fallen. I do believe that, just given the fact that there has been a lot of momentum south of Mykolaievka and Novoekonovichny, that would end up being the case just sort of naturally as a state of affairs. But in terms of something that's actually been proven, there's no proof of that for now. There are claims by some Russian sources that they've been able to resume their assaults across the Dobropillya Bulge, including an assault north of Kucherov Yar to Vesele. So again, this is just for the record. I'm not saying this actually occurred. And you can see on the map, I haven't really changed anything. There are also claims that this bulge to the west of Shekhove is beginning to close and that the Russians are trying to approach Shekhove not only from the east, but also from the west now. And that's with the intention of fully closing the Kazany-Turets River line pockets, which extends from Volodymyrivka all the way to Turetsky and Sofivka. You can see that arrow over here indicating the span that I'm referring to. There was also some claims of a Russian counterattack near Pankivka, but what is actually being referred to here is that the Ukrainians are releasing proof of destroyed motorcycles and killed Russian soldiers in areas that have already been under Russian control and have been for really ever since they were captured, as in the Ukrainians were never able to counterattack successfully and take over Pankivka or Mayak. But now they're releasing images of the Russians getting killed over there as if this is a new development, as if the Russians have just now been able to take it back, or at least are trying to fight for it. But the truth is they were always stationed over there, and now they're just accumulating forces, including armored vehicles for the first time. And the Ukrainians are just ramping up their efforts at targeting them with their drone crews over here. That's all there is to the story, but it does vindicate all of the other earlier reports that the Russians were never, in contention or about to lose Pankivka, for instance. The Ukrainians had never counterattacked and taken it over in its entirety. There's no proof that was ever produced to back that up. And actually, something interesting is that some Russian sources claim they've been able to retake Vilny. And there's footage from October 5th of the Rozvitka units of the 25th Assault Battalion, which is a unit that the Ukrainians have deployed over here. And it shows that there were grenade drops on houses and tree lines to the north of Vilny and even inside of Vilny. So if that video is new, which it may not be new, but if it is new, then it would actually confirm that the line of contact looks more like this. And this is just further proof that the Dobropillya pocket continues with the sort of defensive gumption needed to hold out for a long period of time, even when it comes to the sort of depth of it, all the way to Kucher VR and then to the south, along the logistics are holding out. But there's also an ability to counterattack. There's an ability to, accumulate forces from the 110th Brigade and then counterattack on a local level, despite the fact that there are a lot of bottlenecks logistically. But the only other thing that I've noticed recently on Russian channels is that they claim to have taken back the northern part of Nikanorovka. Again, I'm monitoring it, and I'm always going to inform you guys of what they're saying, because you guys can use that to draw your own conclusions, but I'm not going to change the map solely based off of that. Over here around Yablonivka and Alexander Kalinove, we have a footage from Playfro, and it shows that there were a couple of Russian soldiers killed due to grenade drops on a trench north of Alexander Kalinove. This is important because for the first time, we now have the gray zone shifting northwards, significantly to the north of the two villages, Yablonivka and Alexander Kalinove, about 1.5 kilometers to the north. And there is a trench network over here. There are many trench networks that have still not been taken over by the Russians in the immediate vicinity of Yablonivka, including this outer sort of ring that you see over here, including areas near the Kupyansk reservoir, including locations that are running along T04, 504 highway. Those are all locations that will have to be cleared out eventually, including all the ridges on which they're located, in order for the Russians to eventually assault Kostyantynivka from the southwest, which has been a plan, sort of a long-term desire for a while, but it's never really materialized due to the fact that there are so many well-defended Ukrainian strongholds over here. But there is a bit of a gap in this location. This is a location with some forested areas and a couple of roads, but the Russians were able to reach this particular trench line and they were killed over there. So nobody's really in control of it. But it is a threat because let's say the Russians do actually solidly get control over it, then they'll have an access point by which to cut off the entirety of the western approaches or western entry-exit points into the Kupyansk pocket. And then from there, they'll have no choice, the Ukrainians, the couple dozen that are still located over here, to cross over by boats. And that's going to be something extremely difficult to do out in the open. They'll be spotted by drone crews and targeted accordingly. And so this is why the Ukrainians are doing everything they can when it comes to, deploying drone resources to try to avert such a scenario where the western approaches are fully cut off. And then Ukrainians forces, either individually at night or, trying to use concealment, just try to retreat along the western edge, because that's currently one of the options that they're banking on in order to try to hold out for long as possible. They hope to have that assurance of the fact that they can leave using the western ledge. But that's not necessarily confirmed. That's not guaranteed right now. And looking more generally at the Kostyantynivka direction, let's turn off the trenches. But you can see over here that 2 square kilometers worth of territory was captured in the direction of Ivano-Polya. The Russians are getting very close to Ivano-Polya. They've crossed over several layers of trenches, 1, 2, and now 3, if we're being charitable. It could be even more. And those trenches have been taken over, at least partially. And from there, running along the highway, they have an opportunity to enter into the village of Ivano-Polya. And first of all, cut it off, but then to actually storm and sort of actually permeate within the houses, within the basements. Let's turn off the fortifications, though, so this becomes more clear. The Russians have this video over here that was published October 7th. Predator Police Brigade, FPV strikes and grenade drops by Ukrainians onto the trench network east of Ivano-Polya, because that's where the Russians were present after all. They were storming a trench and they turned it into their own accumulation point. That's actually a recurring theme, not just over here, but in many other locations, like the Yanchur River line. There were fortifications, but eventually they turned into a hindrance for the Ukrainians because the Russians used them as their own forward operating posts and used them to absorb the artillery and FPV strikes from the Ukrainian end. And so it's always a double-edged sword, especially if the Ukrainians never had the wherewithal to hold on to the trench in the first place. So they just built it up and then ended up gifting it to the Russians in effect, obviously unintentionally years after they were initially built, but that ended up being sort of the practical effect of it. But in many other cases, the trenches, like in Yablonivka, paid off significantly and helped the Ukrainians delay Russian assaults by half a year. So it's obviously going to vary depending on the front. Over here in Ivano-Polya, though, you could see how there is really not a lot of depth for the Ukrainians. It's a concentrated village, and it's not that large, meaning that now that the Russians are getting close and could actually get a foothold, it's going to be very difficult to expel them. And then from there, you have to look at the implications for the pocket to the east, where you have just tree lines and not even fortifications. There is barely any sort of anchor for the Ukrainians over here. So eventually this salient will also close, and then you'll have a unified salient, a unified push by the Russians from Bilohora all the way to the Shanghai and Saturnivka microdistrict in eastern Kostyantynivka. And that will unify with the groupings near Ivanopilya and Plashivka, and then also, as we move southwards, all the other possessions that are all running along the Kryvyi-Terets river line. And there are so many pockets over here, and that's the intended desire for the Ukrainians. They want to continue holding out in small groups in order to prevent continuity, in order to prevent unity between various vectors of Russian assault, because that would give them the flexibility needed to push together along a sort of single coordinated assault to close in on the southeastern outskirts of the city. And now let's move on. You can see that just south of Stopochki, about 1 square kilometer of territory captured, just yet again, an area that's extended and really difficult to hold on to, where you have the Ukrainians with a couple of dozen of their forces in quarries, in forced patches, in some of the individual dugouts, pushing back the Russians or holding out. Now the Russians have been able to chip away at some of their possessions, but there is still this large salient that remains a thorn in Russia's back, preventing any level of coordination west of the Donbass Canal between the Chasiv Yar and Toretsk garrisons. So about 7 square kilometers still needs to be cleansed, and then from there will be the necessary outlets to arrive at Prutichny, and of course from there at the eastern outskirts of all of Kostyantynivka. So you can see how all of this is a part of a concerted effort to close in on the city from several particular axes. Over here in Siversk, I didn't even mention it in the beginning, but there are updates from Siversk. 47 hectares worth of territory captured in Kuzminivka. October 6th of this video from the 88th Motor Rifle Brigade shows their storming of the hamlet, which is just naturally going to be like an appendage of the capture of Prigozhin, because it would just be impossible for the Ukrainians to hold on to the village just to the west of it, even if there is the river separating them. The Bakhmutovka is very narrow, and just in terms of proximity, it's so close to Prigozhin that it's more or less the same village. And from there, you could see how the base is expanding, and that can be used to eventually reach Zvanivka, which is one of the larger villages along this Bakhmutovka river line. Over here near Siversk, though, another advance on it to 0.6 square kilometers shows that on October 7th, the Sky Fury units of the 3rd Battalion of the 54th Mechanized Brigade connected FEB strikes onto dugouts, and that gave us a good indicator of another advance. And this means that the Russians are now, if we're measuring it, about 2.3 kilometers away from the city itself. Let's turn on the trenches so you guys get a reference to the extent of the defenses over here. There are still some trench networks that have to be overrun to the southeast near this pond, and then also near the immediate perimeter. So those will naturally be targets for the Russian side. And yet again, I'm warning of the fact that this salient over here to the east and to the southeast of Zvanivka is in grave danger going forward. Let's move on, though, to Kupyansk, because I've made adjustments to the front line over there. Now, I've not changed the Russian sphere of control because there's not really been a geolocation to back it up. But in terms of the gray zone, I've really shifted the degree to which the Ukrainians control much of the western part of the city. And when I say I've shifted it to a far more cautious sort of depiction of the situation. So you could see that the Russians have a larger gray zone afforded to them between Moskovka and Sobolivka. So the Russians are getting pretty close to Sobolivka, actually. They've been able to infiltrate with DRG squads along this highway, this really important highway that feeds into the center of Kupyansk. And then from there, they were able to move southwestwards towards this microdistrict just to the north of the Jubilee microdistrict. So there are two districts over here. The Jubilee one is the one that contains all of the high rises, and then you have the low rises to the west near the Kharkivsky road and near Vitalia Movchana over here. And so those locations are currently in the gray zone as DRGs try seeping into the basements and are able to then use it as a permanent settling point and expansion node. This also means that the Ukrainians are a bit cut off in this region near Vulitsia Pidlisna or Vulitsia Oleha Koshovho. These are locations that are not really connected to the rest of Kupyansk. They're more so connected to the forested networks. And so maybe there is a level of coordination through there, but it is more difficult. And it all makes sense. The logic behind the DRGs advancing over here is really sound because you have a lot of forested patches and you do have a lot of these more stretched out locations. You don't really have major apartment buildings over here. So it always made sense for the DRGs to take the path of least resistance, both to the east and to the west of the city center. And now all the attack vectors are beginning to converge around the city center. And it's located in a salient that is very thin and very much cut off and very deep within what could be considered Russian dominated territory. And as the DRGs continue to solidify control, especially to the west, because this is where the penetrations have been the deepest, as long as they continue doing so, they're going to be able to put further and further pressure on the rail station, on the Kupyansk River, and on any of the buildings or structures that are currently gluing together the supply lines. And you could already see how there are cracks beginning to form, even to the east, with the Russians crossing over the main road moving southwards. It's called, I don't know if it shows it in English over here, but there is this main road over here. Yeah, Vulitsia Pershokho Shravnaya. And it's already been crossed. DRGs are already located near the local lore museum, near the local central city hospital, near the post office. And so, in effect, the Ukraine-dominated logistics line is only about 400 meters in width. So it's getting very thin. And as a result, the Ukrainians that are still located in these high-rises over here, near Vulitsia Ukrainska, just to the south of it, and then near some of these low-rises that are adjacent to the rail line, like they're in a position where they are extremely isolated, and that's by design. That's how the DRGs maneuvered in such a way where they bypassed the areas where there would be the strongest Ukrainian resistance, and thereby created really untenable situation for them by exploiting their flanks and then preempting them into a potential withdrawal in the future. But that's something that has not happened yet, so we'll have to wait and see. And then from there, all the aftermath would be that most of Western Kupyansk would already be within this sort of Russian domain. And just as a result of the reinforcements all being redirected to Kupyansk rather than the eastern bank of the Oskar River, we're seeing now advances near Stepovo Novoselivka and Pishane for the first time. So 2.6 square kilometers worth of territory captured. Video from October 6th shows the Heavenly Nightmare unit of the 43rd Mechanized Brigade. And they conducted FPV strikes and grenade drops onto forested patches. And that gives us an indication of deeper advances. Let's actually measure the distance for a moment so you guys get an idea of the scale. It's about 3.4 kilometers. Now, to finish off, we can see that in Sumy, there's been a change in the dynamics. And that's, I believe, because the Ukrainian forces understood that the situation in Sumy was stable. They've been able to achieve most of their objectives over here when it comes to their counterattacking campaign during the summer. And as a result, they've been able to redirect a lot of their air assault forces and also some of the assault regiments away from here. And that's reduced the offensive efficacy and just the sheer size of the Ukrainian force. It's much smaller than it previously was. And that's just a natural consequence of having to move and shuffle forces around from one place to another. But what it means is that now the Russians have been able to regain some initiative and retook about 8.5 square kilometers of territory. So from Volodymyrivka, they were able to push about 1.8 kilometers southeastwards along a paved road and are very close to cutting off Novomykolaiivka in its entirety because they've been able to envelop it pretty much from the south, from the east, west, and north. So the only outlet left for a withdrawal would be towards Verashny, which is another local hamlet that was never taken over by the Russians, or maybe it was for a brief moment in time, but it was retaken by the Ukrainians. But now there is a potential for the Russian forces over here to restart their campaign, and the goal would be, and this is a very sort of realistic and sobering goal, the goal would just be to simply alleviate the pressure that Oleksivka is enduring on its eastern flank, meaning a push in this direction southwards. And that would be enough on like a local level to just improve the tactical situation, because we were very close at certain points over the past month to a complete cutting off of Oleksivka due to the Ukrainian pressure surrounding it, including from the west, where you have still just a major Ukrainian advance that has been solidified near Andrivka and near the Kindrashivka reservoir, and then also to the east near Novomykolaiivka and Verashny. So that situation is beginning to change simply due to the fact that Ukrainians redirected their forces elsewhere before they were fully done with their counterattacks in this area. And just one last note is that the 13th Battalion of the 95th Air Assault Brigade is now the only part of the sort of air assault corps or air assault elements that is still engaged in Yunikivka. because I saw their casualty reports in some of their recent videos. But you do have the 71st Jaeger, which is also a part of the Air Assault Corps, one of the two Air Assault Corps, because there are two Air Assault Corps that are split up. And so 71st is in one of them. And then you also have the 80th, which is more so stationed to the east. But that's all I have for today. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video, and goodbye.